Good afternoon to all our members and attendees of today's Rural Press Club of Queensland online October event. For those of you joining what is today our 7th online event, thank you. While we usually hold these events in person at the Tattersalls Club in Brisbane City, as you're all aware, the current COVID-19 climate changed that. As a committee, we're thrilled with the attendance we've received to our online events. It's been a great response. So thank you for your support and thanks for logging on today and also to our past events. My name's Michael Blakeney and I'm a Managing Partner at Riberian Capital Partners. And I'm also a member of the Rural Press Club of Queensland's committee. I have the pleasure today of filling in for our President, Stacey Wordsworth, who's unable to join us in person. Before I start, I'd like to make particular mention of our sponsors, McCulloch Robertson, Sun Super and CBRE, whose support has been unwavering throughout the COVID-19 disruption, despite the fact we haven't been able to hold our events in the usual way. So as a club, we say thank you again. Also got a couple of housekeeping items that might be useful for attendees. Today, we're hosting a panel discussion and the format is that you'll hear from each of the panelists before we move into our Q&A session, when you will then have the chance to pose questions with Ali Felton-Taylor, our facilitator, who'll ask them on your behalf. Now, to submit your questions, you'll just need to click on the Q&A box on your screen and then type your questions in. When you do, please provide your name and who your question is intended for, and we'll attempt to get through as many as we can in the time we have during today's session. Now, to today's event, the state of play for Australia's agricultural trade with China, challenges and the road ahead. Over the past decade and beyond, the Australian agricultural industry has benefited enormously from the growth in the Chinese export market. But as we'll hear from our panellists today, in 2020, it's been challenged by a volley of barriers to trade on beef, barley, wine, and just recently cotton. Facilitated by Ali Felton-Taylor, a panel of Ben Lyons, Jeffrey Wilson and Scott Waldron, who are all experts in China and Australian trade, will detail recent developments in the Sino-Australian political and trade relationship and discuss new research on the causes and impacts of barriers to the trade. They will seek to generate an open dialogue about how Australian agricultural interests can be best dealt with and managed in the current trade and that environment. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Ali Felton-Taylor. For many Queenslanders, she doesn't need much introducing as Ali presents the ABC Country Hour each Thursday and Friday from the Toowoomba Bureau. The move to Toowoomba in 2018 broke new ground nationally as the only Country Hour program to be based outside of capital city. Prior to that, Ali was the rural reporter for Southern Queensland, following stints with the ABC in Mount Isa, Longreach and Rockhampton. I also note it's 75 years of the Queensland Country Hour this year, so congratulations, fantastic history. Dr. Jeffrey Wilson is the Research Director at the Perth, USA Asia Centre. Jeffrey specialises in the regional economic integration of the Indo-Pacific. He has particular expertise in the politics of trade agreements, regional economic institutions, and Australia's economic ties with Asia. Dr. Scott Waldron is a Senior Lecturer and Senior Research Fellow at the School of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the University of Queensland at St Lucia. Scott grew up on a mixed farming property in Western Queensland, which provided a solid practical base for his career focus on agricultural economics. He has conducted 15 agricultural research and development projects in China. He's provided technical assistance in trade negotiations on beef and wool, plus speaks fluent Chinese, useful given his focus. Finally, Associate Professor Ben Lyons is the Executive Director at the Rural Economies Centre of Excellence. The centre is a Department of Agriculture and Fisheries funded research collaboration between the University of Queensland, the University of Southern Queensland, James Cook University and CQ University. Ben leads a diverse team of experienced researchers investigating what makes rural and regional economies thrive across regional Australia. Previously, Ben worked in China and Asia over 2 decades in agribusiness, media and research roles. Welcome to you all, and over to you, Ali, for what should be a fascinating discussion.
Thanks very much, Michael. And of course, to all the Rural Press Club for inviting me back. This is my second time moderating this year, and I've really got to congratulate the Press Club on its online webinar content. It's been absolutely smashing, allowing everyone to get together and for the monthly delving into things pertaining to agricultural Queensland to be ongoing is absolutely fantastic. It's been great. So I'm feeling the pressure. But thank you to everyone who have jumped on. Why wouldn't you? It's been amazing watching this Sino-Australian ag export relationship over this year, and I'm really keen to dig deeper with the help of our three panellists into what's happened to this multi-billion, I should say, that's billion with a B, billion-dollar trade. So things like beef, barley, wine and cotton, of course, a list of some of our most valuable exports to China, but it's a list in a different context this year, and we'll delve into that really soon. But if you'll indulge me on a timeline of headlines, first of all, I'll rattle through those as quickly as I can. And I must say, regrets, I have a few. I wished I could do share screening, but instead I'm going old school. And we're going to start just at the end of last year, the 31st of December, because that was at the point where China alerted the World Health Organization as to a cluster in Wuhan. That was on the 31st of December last year. And it was actually released by the WHO on the 5th of January 2020, saying pneumonia of unknown causes in China. It was a disease outbreak news alert by the WHO. Which then, of course, takes us to mid-April. At that point, indeed, Australia's lobbied for an independent review into the origins of the virus. I've got this Reuters headline here, which is saying Australia demands coronavirus inquiry, adding to pressure on China. And following swiftly from that, of course, was the response, indeed, by the ambassador. Federal government calls Chinese ambassador about comments on trade boycott over coronavirus inquiry. So it was at this point in April that things were starting to heat up, particularly pertaining to this conversation. And in April, it was when those ag trade issues were telegraphed, several major Australian grain groups issuing a joint statement saying the industry understands China is potentially proposing to place tariffs on barley imported from Australia. So we had headlines like this one from ABC Rural: Australian farmers caught in the middle as China expected to announce tariffs that would end the barley trade with Australia. And of course, at that time, as we'll hear in Western Australia, China tariff threats to Australia forced farmers to pause mid-planting. That's if they hadn't planted it already. It certainly made them think twice, really, at that point. And just on that subsidy claim, it was understood they were referring to Australia's fuel rebate and drought support measures together with the dumping tariff would effectively, of course, put an end to Australia's barley trade with China. But it was beef that bit the dust first officially, because on the 12th of May, and this is a Beef Central headline, that China has suspended 4 Australian beef plants amid growing trade tensions. So that was the 12th of May. Of course, we know them well. Kilcoy, which is a Chinese-owned company, the 2 JBS plants, Beef City just out of Toowoomba and Dinmore, and of course across the border into New South Wales in Casino, the Northern Cooperative Meat Company there. Not much comment from any of those entities about that situation, but the Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, at that time said suspensions were based around technical issues and were linked to labelling and health certificate requirements. And as we know, even now, these meatworks remain suspended from the China trade. Of course, just looking at that beef export market and the value of that, it's of course on 29 figures at least our top export destination for Australian beef, some 300,133 tonnes shipped weight of boxed beef worth $2.67 billion. That's according to Meat and Livestock Australia. And May was a busy month because just under a week later, the barley sector's worst fears in this sense were realised, with China confirming an 80% tariff on barley, devastating Australian farmers. We know that well now. At the time, the Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, said Australia was deeply disappointed by the news and rejected the basis of this decision. And just on that import tax, we understand it will remain in place for 5 years. Of course, that expected to wipe out the sales into that lucrative market, and we'll delve into that a little more. Then, of course, come August, it was another industry's turn. Australia's wine sector was being investigated for China for allegedly violating anti-dumping rules. Oh, we've got a headline for that as well. China's wine dumping allegations leave the industry gobsmacked, both in Australia and in China. That was an ABC article of the time. Now, also in late August, a fifth abattoir was banned from exporting to China. That was Warwick-based Meats John D, after concerns a chemical was found in some meat. So John D Abattoir suspended from exporting meat to China due to a chemical discovery. It, of course, remains banned from the China trade. At that time, Ag Minister Dave Littleproud said there was nothing malicious about the ban. He said it was imposed after a chemical was found in the meat supplied to China from John D. And then August, again, a busy month. A few more days later, back to one on the 31st, and China confirmed it was launching an investigation into alleged subsidies of Australian bottled wine. So again, we have a headline from ABC, and China correspondent Bill Birtles was still in China at that point. China launches second probe into Australian wine, claiming government subsidies could infringe trade rules. There were certainly plenty more things going on for the wine trade at that stage. Then, of course, early September, another headline for you, but pertaining back to barley. China has suspended barley imports from Australia's largest grain exporter, CBH, that reported by the ABC, which brings us to this month, and cotton. Australian cotton, the latest casualty in trade tensions with China. And just a few days ago, interestingly, the ABC has reported, Cotton Australia Chairman Hamish McIntyre has explained that unlike the barley tariffs and the beef suspensions that we've heard of, there's been no formal word from the Chinese government. And of course, while ever there are rumours of tariffs, that hasn't really been confirmed anywhere by the Chinese government and the Cotton Australia, nor the Australian government hasn't confirmed that either. And of course, that's not a bad thing. So I've rattled through that headline for you, plenty of headlines in that timeline. And we've been focusing, of course, on agriculture, but our country's exporting big hitter, the Australian resources industry, and its China trade is at a timeline all of its own. And it makes for some very interesting reading. And perhaps most notable of this is just this month, the verbal ban on Australian thermal and coking coal into China. So certainly the resources sector is seeing some incredible times as well, which takes us to the panel and onto timings as well. I'll just check my time. Oh, heck, I'm already over already. So we better gallop into our panellists. I did a little bit of research and found out that two of the gentlemen actually coincidentally grew up quite close to each other. Ben was from Glenmorgan and Scott was from Westmar on the Western Downs, so they were quite close together. Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, though, grew up in New South Wales, just near the Blue Mountains, but of course is based in Perth now. But I did track back and find out that he does have some Queensland links, and I have to say that they could be traced all the way back to Longreach. And I think he said at that point that one of his forebears was there when the flush toilet came into being at Longreach. And you think things were going down in 2020. Imagine being back in Longreach in the 1930s. So, Jeff Wilson, we might start with you. You're going to provide a broader political and economic backdrop, and I might just say that we're tight for time already, so this might sort of be an indicator if that's okay. Sorry, it's an annoying little bell, but we have to keep to time. So over to you, Jeffrey Wilson, then we'll talk to Scott and Ben and get the thrust of some of what's been going on in 2020.
Too easy. Thanks, Ali. That's a great introduction. And for clarification, my paternal grandfather, Malcolm Jeffrey Wilson, was born in Longreach in 1933 and remembers the first porcelain toilet arriving in town. But look, what I wanted to do to kick off our discussion was to try and put some of this story, the headlines Ali's just given us, in a bit of a broader political backdrop. And I think the most important thing for us to bear in mind here is that for many years there's been what I call a political economic firewall built into Australia's relationship with China. And this is a kind of implicit bargain that was designed to let the economic relationship between two otherwise very different countries carry on. It basically recognised that the two governments are likely to clash periodically at the political level, fairly obviously due to the huge political and social differences between the countries, but that something was needed to unlock the mutually beneficial economic ties that would benefit both sides. And so it was effectively an implicit agreement that the government-to-government Australia-China thing would work on one track, the business-to-business thing would work on another, and to the best of our abilities, we wouldn't let one track influence or change the other one. That firewall's held pretty steady for nearly 50 years now, and there's been lots of ups and downs and periods of crises. But what we've seen despite that is that the trade and investment relationship has just grown steadily, and we've never seen political issues derailing that badly. And for agriculture, this was extremely important because it allowed China to become Australia's top agricultural export market in the last decade, where exports to China quadrupled between 2009 and 2019 to $16 billion. Unfortunately, what's happened, and as Ali described with these trade sanctions for the first time in 2020, is that political economic firewall has broken down. There's been a lot of political irritants and factors behind that, and there isn't any one thing that either side did that I would specifically say that was what it was. But the straw that broke the camel's back was the Australian government's demand for an independent international inquiry into the origins of coronavirus that was made at the start of April. And that has led to a response from the Chinese government that has seen a level of rage and diplomatic fury directed towards Australia that we've never seen before. What was new this time around wasn't just the diplomatic sanction, but that China's also moved to leverage Australia's trade dependency to apply political pressure onto the Australian government. And we've seen a wide range of these restrictive trade measures that Ali outlined, and they've been applied in industries specifically selected for their dependence on the Chinese market, maximise pain on the Australian side. We certainly have seen that rural industries have been singled out, but that's not for anything that the farm sector has or hasn't done, but solely because Australia depends a lot on China for its agricultural exports, but often in many products not the reverse. It's a sector where we depend on them a lot, but they can sanction with relatively less cost on their side. And we've seen barley, beef, wine and cotton in the farm sector. And I'd also add to that list travel advisories, which are effectively a trade sanction against tourism and education, as well as the coal issues. Interestingly, if you take education out of that 7 industry story, the other 6 are all rural sectors. And if you add the numbers up, last year, those 7 affected sectors accounted for $48 billion of exports to China, about 1/10 of our national exports. You may also know that a purported hit list of future targets has also been leaked to the media, and that includes dairy, seafood, oats, and several horticultural products on it as well. When the Australian government's tried to challenge these measures, the Chinese government's responded by simply refusing to engage. And since May, the Australian Trade Minister has been unable to get a phone call or official acknowledgement from his counterpart. So we're running almost 5 months of not picking up the phone there. One contextual factor I'd like to put into this is we're not alone in facing this kind of trade dependence tactic from the Chinese government, because China has a long history of using this form of trade coercion to score diplomatic points. Japan copped it in rare earth minerals in 2010, Norway for salmon in 2011, Philippines bananas 2012, Mongolian coal 2016, Taiwanese tourism 2016, Korean automobiles 2017, Canada, canola, soy, pork and beef last year. And so now 2020, it's been Australia's turn. I think the thing to remember, and we often lose this discussion in Australia, is if you look at that broader and longer span, this isn't something new for China to be doing, and Australia is not especially special here. It's just our turn to face this kind of behaviour. But just to finish, for the Australian farm sector, it is a major problem. China has been our most significant growth market for many years, and in the last decade, 2/3 of all agricultural export growth went to China. It now sits at a 31% market share that towers over that of all other trade partners. Japan comes at 12% and the US comes third at 9%. And in some rural subsectors, particularly things like barley or wine, dairy, fruit and timber, they depend on China for over half of their exports. In some cases, we see China dependence up in the 80-90% range. So in other words, the Australian farm sector has a serious China problem. It's not the industry's fault, but it is a major problem. It's a political problem, and it's not likely to go away anytime soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson. I'm looking at timings and we will have to get it. Sorry about the ding there, but we will have to jump next to our next panellist, which is Dr. Scott Waldron. And I forgot to mention in the intro, incredibly, from 1992 to 1999, Scott was over in China. And then from that, in his role at USQ, he says for about 3 months of every year, and that went on for 20 years, he's spent time in China. And of that, he's travelled, of the 32 provinces in China, I understand he's travelled to around 20. So certainly muddy boots work over there in China. Scott Waldron, over to you to give us a little bit more context to really drill down into barley, because that's been a huge case for Australia.
Okay, thanks, Ali. And I'm going to try and share these slides, hopefully. And thanks to the Press Club for running this event about what is obviously a topical and very important issue for Australian agriculture. And we've been looking at it, especially from the Chinese perspective. So looking at the policy drivers and the market drivers that has caused China to implement these trade barriers that we're talking about. And so I'm going to try and illustrate that, especially in the case of barley, and using this figure, which there's a lot going on in this figure, but if we'll try and work our way through it, firstly by looking at this left-hand axis here. So we're talking millions of tons of barley. And in 1992, China produced 4 million tons of barley. And if you follow this red line, that dropped to 2 million tons by 2017. So over that 35-year period. At the same time, if you follow this yellow line, Chinese imports of barley had tracked around that 2 million ton level until they went through the roof in 2013-14 for reasons we can talk about later if you want. And the result is this these blue bar graphs we're looking at here. And what that really shows of total Chinese barley supply use, 15% came from within China, 85% was imported. And that situation contravenes China's policy on food security. China wants to be able to produce a substantial amount of its own food domestically to feed its own population. And on top of that, if we look at this green line here, we can see that of that already high level of imports, Australia accounted for, well, in some years between 70 and 80% of those imports. So this contravenes another set of policies from China about import diversification. So China doesn't want to be importing from singular sources for serious food crops like barley. And particularly not from a country that China sees not as a political ally, because it thinks that then leaves China in what it calls a passive, a beidong position if a trade war erupts, for example. So as a result, China started this investigation in the dumping of Australian barley in 2018. The findings came out in May this year, and their arguments were firstly that Australia subsidises domestic barley production. Secondly, that Australia then dumped that barley into China at below market prices. And thirdly, that then damaged the Chinese domestic barley production, and importantly, barley producers, which are small farmers, mainly from the inland interior, this yellow soil area, which is quite remote and poor part of China. So that was their argument, and we went through all the documents, character by character, and all the statistics, and including with Jeff actually. and none of them stand up to scrutiny. It's a spurious case. And that's what Australian industry and government have argued in hundreds of pages of submissions, which, as Jeff said, have been ignored. So that's Bali. And what I outlined then is China's nearly using what you call good old-fashioned protectionism for its domestic industry. And we've done a similar analysis on wine, and there's a lot of similarities. Some of the shapes that we saw in those figures apply pretty closely to wine. Beef is different because China's been able to diversify its import sources a lot over the last 5 to 6 years. Cotton's a bit different again. But what the pattern here is that China is using these instruments to advance its interests, its short-term and long-term interests. It's not shooting itself in the foot by taking these measures. But the measures are, in 2020 at least, directed at Australia because it doesn't like our foreign policy. And it's directed, as Ali said, at the big commodities. So this is 4 of the top 5 export commodities from Australia to China. And as Jeff also said, that that was designed to inflict damage on Australia. And so political scientists would call that coercion, measures to try and change Australian policy. So that's happening. And then the instruments that China is using in these barriers is really interesting. So there's the normal sort of instruments about anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariffs for barley and wine. Beef is a bit different because we're talking about more technical issues, so plant certification, disease protocols, sanitary, phytosanitary measures, labeling. Cotton is different again. So this is a new one, I think, where China just had a verbal decree not for importers not to apply for quota for Australian cotton, which it didn't do for other countries. That was the same instrument used for coking coal and for thermal coal in that same round. So what we're looking at here is a series of events that took place, but underlying that are signs of more structural problems. So within China, signs of economic nationalism, certainly signs of economic coercion, and it's mantling of multilateral trade systems, then a bit of fraying. So the message from this is it's not just a small diplomatic sort of stoush taking place here that will be fixed by more refined diplomacy. Some of these issues are serious and structural, and that has to guide our response as a country and the agricultural sector, which, sorry, I'm over time, Ali, but maybe we'll get later.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, look, there's so much to touch on there, some incredible insight. Let's go to our next panelist for his different take on things. Associate Professor, I should say, Ben Lyons. Ben also has spent a lot of time in China, in fact, mirrored a lot of what Scott had done. He first went in 96 and had about 4 tours all up, I think, until 2015. I think at that time he left. He was the deputy chair of the AusCham Shanghai Board of Directors. He's been quoted in plenty of media as well. Ben Lyons, over to you, and a lack of true integration into the Chinese market. Is that something you're going to touch on?
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Scott and Jeff and the Rural Press Club and Michael for the opportunity. Yeah, I suppose one of the underlying themes of having been up in China when we were in sort of China fever years, which has been this past decade, and the lead into the free trade agreement or the CHAFTA, one of the telling stats I think it was an issue back then, or I think is an issue, is that 90% of Australia and China's trade is done by 15 companies. So we don't have that interface. We're very much the relationship, whilst it's very large in economic terms, the social interaction of, particularly from the SME sector, which was where a lot of effort went into CHAFTA in terms of bringing SMEs in. The economics are challenging. It's a big faraway market for many SMEs and beyond reach. So that's led to a lot of, we have also relied on, investment from China, I suppose, but obviously that hasn't worked for our friends at Kilcoy, which is a very, New Hope group out of China, a very large protein producer and significant investor in Australia. They've been damaged by that banning, and that's a challenge. I think I also, look back on, what's been really alarming about your run sheet there from the start of this year is we used to have these sort of annually or from time to time. Our oldest ag relationship has been wool. Michelle's from South Australia has had a relationship, had an office in China since 1919, I think, or the 1920s. It lasted through communism. They still had an operator there, and it's always, I remember back in the 90s when Scott and I were researching livestock in China, Australian wool was bigger than our exports to China were larger than our coal exports. So it's always been a sort of a very strong, and it's even stronger now. I think over 80% of our wool goes to China, and this is an issue. It's an issue because the cotton guys will find that it's whilst beef, and we can sort of diversify that magic word diversification, we can go into beef and other things, and other markets. With textile industries like wool and cotton, you can't pick up factories, and they're integrated into the industry there, and other, later stage processing. I think also that it's been a really challenging time because a lot of effort on Australian ag part, has gone into China, and a lot's been invested, and that's sort of almost been thrown out. You'd think, well, it's not thrown out, but it feels, that way. I know a lot of industries from red meat through to wool have invested a lot in the market, in the Chinese market, because it is just so big, and it is a very, a sweet spot for Australian ag product. We, yes, we compete with Brazil and Argentina in the beef game, but compared to where we were in the late 90s, we've done a great job with the burgeoning Chinese hotel and food service industry, and really placed that product at a real premium level. And I think that's been, I hope that long continues despite these hiccups. But it is easy. I often also worry a little bit, but we frivolously say diversify away, and that sort of is a sort of standard. I think there's some new language there about expansion, trade expansion. I think we might touch on, and those aren't my words. That's Dr. Jeffrey might know more about that than me. But yeah, and I think those human to human and business relationships we have with China have also been quite strong over that time. Like, we have all worked with Chinese colleagues, or worked in Chinese, in Chinese located companies. And, the relationship there was always very strong and very fruitful. It's just a shame, as Jeff said, that the firewall's sort of broken down and the political ideologue has sort of drifted over into the economic. But it was a little bit regretful, and I'll finish my note by a quote from a Chinese cotton contact of mine that said, with his Chinese partners that are obviously heavily affected by this latest announcement, he said, on that COVID thing, maybe you follow, not lead this one. So...
Ben Lyons, thank you. Thanks very much on that note. Absolutely. I'd like to remind people that you can ask questions in our Q&A session. If you just jump to the bottom and post those questions in, time permitting, we will get to those. So please pop them in now or throughout as they come to you. Before you forget them, please pop in your questions. So let's jump into the discussion proper. I've absolutely adored all that history and the incredible depth that you three bring to this. So history of the trade, obviously, it's incredibly important for context. And Ben, you just mentioned wool. But my question to you, and we'll start with Dr. Jeffrey Wilson first of all, has 2020, in this case, have we seen politics spoil a perfectly good trade relationship?
Sorry, my apologies. I think that's definitely the case. And I'd even point out some of the, the value chain connections here in WA. I need to talk about barley. It's a West Australian industry. There's a lot of work went into WA to particularly configure barley for a Chinese market, especially a brewery use. If you've ever had a Qingdao beer, it's probably made with our barley, depending on where you get it. This included a lot of science work combining Chinese and Australian universities around a project to sequence the barley genome that actually was groundbreaking and won international science prizes. And And so it's not just, we can look at the value of the trade this year that we should have expected with this year's rains and crop, and we can say, well, we placed in this other market at a price discount, so we've lost 200 or 300 million dollars is the kind of number I'm hearing. But there's a lot more than that's been undermined. There's decades of scientific work between Australian grain growers trying to get a good product with very little water and declining water in the northeast wheat belt, and Chinese markets who are trying to build their global product and are dependent on that connection between us. So it's not, we can do the exercise of totten up how many dollars we lost at the end of the market. But that relationship loss, I think, is a bigger thing for Australian agriculture as well. After we've spent so long, Ben and Scott have spent most of their careers building that. And what can we do now?
Would you call this a trade war? I know in a similar Rural Press Club event, the opposition spokesperson for AgGol, Fitzgibbon, called it an economic trade war. Are we terming it a trade war?
I've been asked this one before. I would argue a trade war requires two sides to attack each other. Given that this is pretty one-sided, I think the proper terminology would be trade bashing.
I see. To you, Dr. Scott Waldron, and interesting we've heard a lot about Australia's point of view on this, but to do with barley, the barley trade particularly, what is the situation like in China?
It was, there's ABARE's study on this, actually. It was very interesting, that looked at the costs of the tariffs for Australia and China. And for Australia, I think it turned out about $300 million, and partly because the Australian barley growers could grow to other markets and could substitute into other winter crops, especially wheat, so it reduced the impact. But the impact in China, they estimated, was about $3.2 billion. So for the reasons Jeff's talking about, because they had designed all their inputs, set their machines, set their markets, their pricing for Australian barley. And Australia has developed a whole new barley standard for China. So this barrier really costs, especially the brewers, but also the feed, barley was used for seed as well, big time. And Chinese industry made submissions against those barriers to the Chinese government, the Ministry of Commerce, and they were just dismissed completely, because in China, these bigger national interests about food security and poor low-income farmers, long-term strategic interests are much more important than the immediate interests of industry. So they were just overridden. Case. So there's interesting political dynamics of what was happening within China.
And would you call this a trade war?
I'm with Jeff on this one. If a trade war is tit for tat, two sides going at each other, then there's a lot more tatting or whatever going on from China. Australia hasn't taken any retaliatory action at all in agriculture, and the fact of just the government and industry have rightly just put their head down and dealt with the technical issues at hand. So no, I wouldn't call it a trade war yet.
On to you, Ben Lyons, and the same question to you. Would you call this a trade war?
Well, it's a sense that it's definitely put our trade at threat. So even though we haven't done anything retaliatory, I suppose Joel's take is that it really, has the same effect on some of our key industries or key exports. So in some ways, call it what it is. It has this impact, which is really adverse.
And to that end, Ben Lyons, the external commentary and indeed the media's interpretation of what's happening. I mean, trade war makes for a fantastic headline. How has that been in terms of the media's take on what's been happening?
Well, it's going to be a lot challenging now that we've got two key, reporters or reporting agencies not in China. That's, with Bill Birtles and the AFR gentleman that's moved back. And, of course, we've got that awful situation where an Australian, actually a UQ alumni, Lei Chung, is still being withheld or, held, and not many people are commenting on that, which is a smart thing to do. But that's, she's a great ally or a great representation of, pre all of this, where the relationship had gotten to, which is the Chinese sort of ethnic, but born and bred in Australia, or grown up and educated, and at the top of us, the media list, to working for a state-owned media agency. So I'd echo that. It's not in a great place, and it's really worrying about we used to fix all these things behind closed doors, Ali, and the fact that we're not getting a trade, minister to minister even. Or the high level bureaucrats, which is where we fixed a lot of these things, is not happening, is the worrying part.
What about the media's interpretation? Is that worrying? Do you think there's a bit too much focus, or?
Yeah, some of our medias. I mean, this again goes back to my thing about the 15 companies and 90% of the trade. A lot of us don't realise where our wealth comes from. Our dig and deliver sort of thing. We're removed from the transaction. So Andrew Forrest has a great one customer relationship, but he generates billions of dollars. But we don't understand that in Australia. So it's quite easy that we get those certain common political commentators that do a bit of an ethnic bashing, in my opinion, which is hardly helpful. And so I'd comment that that one sort of that stereotyping of China is not helpful. And I'd side with a lot of Chinese friends on that.
What about you, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson? What are your thoughts on the way the media's handled this situation in 2020?
This has been a weird year for me. I'm a trade policy specialist by training and trade, and I think in the last 3 months I've done more high-profile media with a lot of the ABC rural coverage and been on Landline talking about SPS restrictions, which is something that used to be down in the weeds and horrible. And it's because it's got this geopolitical overtone to it. It links into coronavirus and the international politics of that, the Trump versus China trade war, a lot of things where peace and stability in the international system are coming apart. And so it's a great headline, like the world goes to hell and we lose our barley or cotton beef, whatever comes after that. But it doesn't help the sector at all. Like, if you're a grower here in WA, you're completely disinterested that lots of columnists who don't know where a WA barley farm is are suddenly writing op-eds in the Australian Financial Review about you. And I think what that means is we really need to have, in this new era where this kind of thing is going to get more common, a bit of a discussion in the industry, but also between the industry and government about when this happens next, because it's not barley's fault, it's not beef's fault, it's not cotton's fault. What can we do to defend against it? And if we can't defend against it, what can we do to maybe look at another market or something? But the previous settings are not going to work. And sitting there going, the sky's falling because China's sanctioning us, does nothing for these rural businesses at all.
Scott Waldron, your thoughts on that, on the commentary, the ongoing commentary and the understanding of just what's happened this year?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of commentary. Papers are flooded with the issues, and it's quite tricky because these barriers and the coercion are rarely backed by official statements from the Chinese government or indeed from the Australian government in some cases. So we're really second guessing in a lot of cases of what's going on, and a bit of speculation going on at all levels, and especially in, for the political issues. But I must say that the rural press in general has been really useful. I think focusing on some of the technical issues that we're talking about, and the market drivers. And as I was saying, they're very important to understand that. And I think that's what Jeff's getting at. We have to get down into the detail of these issues to really work out what's happening so that we can resolve them.
Well, thanks, Scott. We'll indeed take that. But on to then, I suppose, for lack of a better phrase, the blame game, and looking into Australia. Has the government got a case to answer for here? And I'll be very careful in what I'm saying, but obviously CHAFTA was a long time coming. 2005 was when negotiations on that started, and it wasn't until 2015 that it happened. And as Ben detailed before, we were all talking about SMEs heading to China and and drumming up business in China. It was the big focus, especially where I'm sitting here in Toowoomba with the Wellcamp Airport, and I think even Michael Blakeney was on one of those planes that headed over to China. So certainly there's been a lot of focus there. That was from the agribusiness community itself. But what about government? What do you think, Scott Waldron?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think there's often there is this assumption that if China joins the WTO, it's going to liberalize trade. If Australia signs this chapter agreement with China, then the markets are going to work the way they should be, and trade will explode. And that has happened to an extent. But what is interesting is what is underneath. That doesn't happen just in a vacuum. There's a whole apparatus underneath that that most of the audience will know about. So there's government at multiple levels, federal, state, down to the local level, with trade analysts and veterinarians and specialists in phytosanitary standards, plant breeders. Under there's a whole range of industry groups and peak bodies that are working very hard within their own industries and dealing with counterparts in China. And of course, there's all the trade representative offices at state level. So all these bodies have been working to grow the China market. And then now we're facing this situation where it's looking a bit shaky. And then the issue is then how the government responds to that, whether to deploy those sort of resources or the industry bodies to use those resources in other markets to build other markets for diversification.
So in that sense, given what's going on, do you think we've hit peak China in 2020?
That's going to depend a lot on what Chinese policymakers think about it. I think Australia's happy to sell product to China, although I know that a lot of industry groups and companies and farmers are now starting to factor in the risks of dealing with China, which means they'll be looking at other markets or pricing in that risk into dealing with China. So that's putting downward pressure on the trade volumes for sure. There's that, but there's also the fundamental sort of complementarities between the trade that suggests that will continue, short of a trade war.
Ben Lyons, moving on to you, that same question about the blame game. Scott answered about the government situation, but what about industry itself? I mean, every commodity is as complicated as its trade dealings with China in terms of its upper representation. There are lobby groups, there are research and development organisations, and indeed there are councils upon councils and different groups representing each commodity there too. Does a more combined effort have to be made to carve a path out of here? In that sense, Ben Lyons? I'm
always, it's a nice to have, but remember we don't do the collaboration piece great in Australian ag typically. We might do a boundary fence together as neighbours and share a Christmas beer, but generally we do things individual. We celebrate our individuality. I think we found that we worked pretty well in the wool. I always revert to wool because we had the longest history there, and we did a fair bit, and we were dealing with China's own being the largest sheep producer and sheep and wool producer in the world, and we were selling a heap of wool to its mills. And that industry, now that we have the annual sort of most influential industry conference in Nanjing in September each year, since the late 1990s, and we've had our issues there, industry to industry. But when we had a big issue with the Chinese government in 2007, we went to the Chinese industry. They had some quality issues they wanted to talk or understand on the Australian side. And that developed really well. We went with them to the Chinese government, which was a similar sort of admin problem, or actually wasn't similar to the cotton one, but time's tight. But my point is that that's worked really well. I think the red meat industry has found it a bit more challenging because there's 1,400, I think in 2018, there was 1,400 Chinese importers of Australian beef. So it's really hard to organise or see where the peak body is there. But, you know, the wool one, I think they have a fun, literal tug of war with each other at the end of drinks at that Nanjing conference now. It's matured to that state, and we're singing Chinese opera and Frank Sinatra songs together. So it's, you know, it's not all hunky-dory, but it's functional. And I think that, you know, here in Australia, working together has proven hard. I know, you know, again, Andrew Forrest tried to put an 50 Chinese companies and 50 Australian companies together back at the free trade agreement announcement. Not really sure where that branding and that exercise went to. Yeah, we've had stop-start there, Ali, but it would be something that could work but I don't know, and Scott and Jeff might know this better. I don't know whether what the influence of the Chinese industry is back to its own government in this case.
We're going to get to everyone's questions soon, so thank you very much, everyone, for putting those questions in, and please put them in below on Zoom, and we'll get to those if we can. But Ben Lyons, just quickly to you, are there any silver linings in this timing? We've talked about sort of reaching peak China, but what if something like this had happened? And I know there's plenty out of our control, a wedge of things out of our control, but what if this happened a decade later?
If it happened a decade later, we would have been in a worse place, because I think we were still on a trajectory of particularly the medium-sized enterprises investing more heavily in China and in the market, so they would have been more entrenched. So the early adopters, if you like, or disruptors, have set up there and we're fairly entrenched, and you know, but we might have all been like the poor live fish, you know, or live seafood industry, particularly in Jeff's WA mates, that 97% of their product goes to China. We could have all been in that situation, which would make it the diversification thing very difficult.
Yeah, it takes us to diversification, and on to you, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson. Diversification, that word, and words are indeed important. It's something that we've talked about. What's the other phrase? Medium-term opportunities. Rebalance, improve, other options. Where are we at in that sense?
Well, for some people, diversification is considered a dirty word because it's an American word to do with their trade war with China. And well, that's upsetting. So we don't call it diversification. We say expansion or something. But it fundamentally means that, and this is a general business proposition, I think most people get their head around if you take China out of this. If you're 80% to China, 97% to China, I'm naming some WA rural industries here, that's a lot of eggs in any single basket. And when something goes wrong, and it goes wrong with America, it goes wrong with Japan, it goes wrong with Vietnam, this is the long history of Australian ag exports, is that you're in a serious problem. So it's not about trading less with China, that's a lucrative and profitable market, but it is when we think about where's the growth going to come from? Where are we going to do market entry strategies that we haven't before? Where does Austrade put additional boots on the ground? Where does the state and federal departments think about developing strategies? They now need to be looking elsewhere in the region. Our region is great. There's a lot of countries with China's demographics and economic profile. We've just got an FTA with Indonesia with huge ag opening. Vietnam's got some propositions coming down as well. And really, I think the response is to try and grab that bull by the horns in the way that we did with China 10 years ago.
Thanks, Jeffrey. On to a question, and we've eaten in enormously into the Q&A time from the audience, but I have got some questions here. And this question is to Scott Waldron. What impact does the US-China trade tensions have on our ag exports to China? Are we getting sidestepped by two elephants jostling?
Good question. I saw a lot of press about that actually when the beef and barley cases were implemented. And for barley, the phase one deal between the US and China has no effect because the US doesn't produce, it's a net importer of barley. So in that case, China has no impact. And when you go through commodity by commodity, we don't compete directly with the US for the big items, for pork and soybean, wool, beef, and somewhat cotton we do. So that this latest issue is important, but it's hard to make a blanket statement. You have to go through commodity by commodity. And at the end of the day, there's not that many commodities we compete directly. So it's having an impact, but not as big as what it's usually made out to be.
Which leads to another question to you, Scott, from Pamela. What can you say about the suppliers replacing Australia? What are we looking for a swing back to Australia?
Again, it depends by commodity, but for beef, the big competitors are all in South America. So Brazil and Argentina, and China's gone about opening up that market. So that's diversified their imports a lot. So Australia is just another, less than 20% of China's imports. And at the same time, the beef is interesting actually, because the Australian beef sector only exports about 20-something% of its to China. So it's diversified on both sides, which is a pretty good state of affairs that, would be good to see in other industries. And then again, it depends. Barley, the competitors there are Canada, France, Ukraine, but it's different types of barleys, right? So they're not direct competitors for some type of malting barleys. China will be hard pressed filling that gap.
Interesting. A question from Robin to Ben Lyons. What's the future of CHAFTA? They're asking. Does this year highlight failings of FTA agreements?
No, it highlights failings. This year was going to be another year where a key year when 20 and 21, where some of our beef tariff reductions, or across a range of things, tariff reductions were going to kick in significantly. What's the future of CHAFTA? I think it'd be too much of a face issue for them to go back on it. They may plead COVID. Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's CHAFTA's CHAFTA and other things like Belt Road on the Chinese side have sort of filled gaps where WTO and before that APEC and other multilateral sort of arrangements were in place for the region, but they weren't very significantly Chinese-led those. So that's why we've seen BRICS and other things come out. So I think there's going to be a period where China used the FTAs, particularly the Australian one, in my opinion, to say, hey, we're dealing with Australia. They want to deal with us, so we can, a bit like the New Zealand one was used as a bit of like, we're real, we're legal. That's not a puppet country. That's a democracy, Australia. We're mature enough to deal with them, so deal with us. So where it goes to, it'll be very geopolitical.
We've got another question here from, I think this was from Jason to all. How should the ag sector effectively lobby the political sector to follow and not lead? So we might go to you, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, on that one.
Sure. Look, thanks for this. I have certainly heard there's some talk around the place that some commentators grumble, look, the Australian government's just got to fix the relationship with China and get this all back on. But yeah, I mean, as I'm sure this audience has read in many of these stories, there's some pretty serious reasons why the Australian government's taken the positions they've taken diplomatically. We might not agree with how they were all done, but militarisation of islands in the South China Seas, not something Australia can turn a blind eye to for the sake of $200 million worth of barley. And I haven't spoken to a farmer who thinks they should. So I think the conversation has to move out of a really simple, Canberra stuffed it up and can't they just get it back for us, and onto something more productive, as if this is the world we're now living in the 21st century. What can we do around diversification, around defending against this? Can we go to the WTO? Like lots of plan B options. I won't list them all here, but really thinking about what you do about this rather than just hoping someone in Canberra fixes it for us.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And on to a final question, and I'll pose it to you first and then move on to the other three panellists. This one's to all. How do we repair this situation? How do we re-engage?
If the Chinese trade minister won't take our phone calls, we can make them by raising a WTO dispute. That will not be a call from Canberra, it'll be a call from Geneva. Look, we won't go into the trade law stuff. It's all very complicated and Scott and I'll get too excited, but we have a very strong case on barley, beef, you could argue, coal, and maybe cotton, depending on what happens over the next couple of weeks. The Australian government hasn't done that initially in the hope that we could talk first. But if they're refusing to talk, then I say kick it to the umpire.
Scott, do you agree?
Yes, I do, across all those points. And I mean, Australia is a small country in the scheme of things. Maybe sometimes we think ourselves as a middle power. So we really need to operate in an international system bound by rules, so trade rules, investment rules, the law of the sea, human rights, and that's Australia's national interest, an international rules-based system. And that's what the federal government is doing, has to stick to. And I don't think any amount of pressure from any particular business groups would or should change that. Just leave federal policy to the federal politicians to pursue the national interests, and for business and industry to go about doing what it best can to manage the risks. And that's through product placement and pricing and diversification, for sure.
Ben Lyons, your thoughts on that?
I go back to what Jeff highlighted was the key to our success prior to that, which was the firewall between politics and ideologues. And, you know, because just as we have our hawks on the Australian side, the Chinese Communist Party has a variety of opinions within it. So there's hawks on that side too. So if we can divide, if we can split off the economic benefits from the political ideologues that would, and have that firewall back in place would be great. There is a part of me that, you know, looks at, I always used to look at Uruguay, allowed China, was one of the supporters of China joining the UN in 1973. They still benefit from that sign of breaking ranks with the rest of the world. I wouldn't probably advise that, but I did notice that China has a long memory and looks after little old Uruguay. But I think, yeah, there is maybe the rule book will be different. Like, I don't know if WTO will come back to what it was. And legally, I think it's been problematic in terms of execution. So that's, whilst it is a system there and a framework that's existing, we should use, I'm just not sure of the outcome. I think this will be, we need to just rebuild that firewall somehow.
Thanks, Ben. We've come to the end of the Q&A, and we've in fact run over time, but it leaves us just enough time to bookend this whole conversation, really. And I feel like there were a million other things we could have talked about, a billion other things we could have talked about, in fact. But if I could go to you for a takeaway message, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, what's your takeaway message in a minute or so that you want to leave people tuning into this webinar thinking about?
Oh, even less than a minute. Look, this is unfortunate. The Australian rural sector hasn't done anything to deserve it. It's global geopolitics and protectionism, as Scott said. But it is the new normal. We're not going to unscramble this omelette, and we need, whether it's defensive response, diversification, what we can do to make ourselves as competitive and essential as possible. The discussion really needs to be how industry can work with other industry and with government to do that. And that's where we need to go forward, not hoping that there might be some political development in 6 months that just we all go back to 2018 or 19, because I don't think it's going to happen. Thank you. On to you, Dr. Scott Waldron, your takeaway message?
I agree with everything that Jeff just said. And on a broader sort of level, I think we really have to invest a lot in understanding what's happening in China, within China, to understand the forces there and the risks, and then have a coherent strategy to be able to respond to that as a sector, as the agricultural sector comprised of different industry groups. And it is a discussion that we really need to have collectively and proactively. That's a broad sort of fine conclusion there.
Thank you very much. On to Ben Lyons, your takeaway message.
Yeah, more than ever, we'll have to get into the policy intelligence space again more heavily, which is where we were in the 90s, looking at it as a potential market. It worked then in terms of we understood where China was coming from. It'll work again. So I think we need to re-engage and understand what the motivations are at particularly different industry levels and what the drivers are, and engage there and understand that, and then understand the workings, because at the moment it looks like a black box of decision making that we're not understanding or comprehending.
Well, thank you, all three of you, Ben Lyons and Scott Waldron, and indeed Jeffrey Wilson, very much. I feel like that could be, that chat could have expanded. We barely sort of touched and scratched the surface on all the insight that you could give us, but I'd like to thank you very much for being part of this, and hand over to Michael Blakeney.
Thanks, Ali. And again, thank you, Ben, Jeffrey and Scott, for that insightful discussion on the state of play for Australia's agricultural trade with China. I agree, we could have gone on for a long time, but appreciate your thoughts. As with all contributors to the Queensland Rural Press Club, we'll be sending you the exclusive Rural Press Club tie and scarf, Ali, as a small token of our appreciation. Just quickly before we close off the day, we have the National Ag Day coming up on the 20th of November, and the Queensland Rural Press Club is very pleased to announce that our National Ag Day event will be held on the same day, and also that we've secured a credentialed and influential speaker, Alison Watkins, the Group Managing Director of Coca-Cola Amatil, to present to the club on that day. As many of you be aware, Alison has led numerous significant Australian agri-food businesses and brings a level of insight into the national rural sector that I'm sure will be interesting for all. Please look out for the invitations as they'll be coming out next week. Before we wrap up, again, many thanks to the panel, and also importantly, many thanks to our sponsors, CBRE, McCulloch Robinson and SunSuper. Finally, thanks to Ash Nolan and the team at SAS Group. Without Ash, we wouldn't be able to run this platform, and she makes it as efficient as possible. So thanks again, Ash. We hope you've enjoyed today's Rural Press Club online event, and we look forward to hosting you again at our next Rural Press Club National Ag Day event. Bye for now.